right, it's 5 o'clock. Let us begin. Welcome, Furman students and Furman colleagues to this CLP event. This is going to be great. I've been looking forward to it ever since I heard about it. And just so you know, we are going to be talking about this book, Why We Are Restless on the Modern Quest for Contentment, by two of our faculty members at Furman University. And I'm going to set it up by using, I don't know what could be a Homeric simile to explain why I'm looking forward to this and why I really admire this book, and also why I think you all joining us for the CLP event will get a lot out of it, and maybe what you can look for or think about as we go through this. First, let me introduce the two authors, and then I'll say a thing, and then I will hand it over to them, and I won't speak very long. Dr. Benjamin Storey is the Jane Gage Hipp Professor in the Department of Politics and International Affairs at Furman University. In 2016, he was the recipient of the Alistair G. and Janie Earl Furman Award for Excellence in Teaching. He has published widely in scholarly journals and in media for a wider audience on Montaigne, Rousseau, Tocqueville, Locke, and in general, on philosophy and the current state of the nation and our lives. Co-author of the book with him is Dr. Jenna Storey, who is assistant professor in politics and international affairs and executive director of the Tocqueville program. In 2019, she won the Silas N. Pearman Award for teaching in engaged living. Her work has appeared in edited volumes, as well as Perspectives on Political Science, First Things, RealClearBooks.com, The New Atlantis, The Weekly Standard, the Claremont Review of Books, Vogelin View, the Boston Globe, and I think most recently, or very soon, the Washington Post. Dr. Storey is also a board member of the Veritas Preparatory School, where her 3 children are currently studying. Okay, so why do I think this book and this event is a big deal? And then before we turn it over, you can see the big deal. People who deal with infrastructure, which is in the news today, infrastructure. People who deal with infrastructure, especially electricity, talk about the last mile problem. And like all of delivering electricity is a problem, but only the last mile problem gets a name. Duke Energy can build a power plant, buy a bunch of land, hire some lawyers, bunch of engineers, they know what to do. They can buy a strip of land and run power lines to it, to big transformer stations. The last mile is the problem. It's getting it to each person's house. Because at that point, it's not all Duke Energy stuff, it's neighborhoods where people live, apartment buildings, sharing power poles with telephone lines, with cable TV, running it from the pole around that awkward oak tree to the back of your house where the meter is, right? That's the last mile problem. So this is my epic simile. So too, the business of being a professional scholar, which all Furman faculty do, is in some ways fairly easy. I mean, it's laborious, it takes expertise and years of practice, but we know how to do that, right? We can read our books, we have commentaries on them, we can read scholarly articles, you're in the business, you talk to other professionals, we all know the same language, right? It's the last mile problem that's hard, which is taking this scholarly work, this controlled scientific apparatus, and getting it to each house and each person's life. That last mile is too often, I think, relegated to like the 8 minutes at the end of a class when everybody's putting stuff in their bags. Okay, this is the last mile, right? This book. And I think it's an incredibly admirable thing. It's a wonderful book. I urge you all to read it, that you're going to hear about it today. And the last thing I want to say is, it's, for those of us in the professor business, it's easy not to write a book like that. We can get promoted and paid and go to conferences without ever doing all that work to take this professional expertise and bring it up the driveway and around the back and into the house. And so That's why I admire this book. What I also admire this opportunity, and I'm going to shut up and you're not going to hear from me anymore except introductions, is what we're going to get to see, which is an example of smart people who aren't experts in the particular topic of this book, reading it and reacting to it. This is what we're supposed to do at a liberal arts college. We're all supposed to be smart. We're not all supposed to know everything, but we're expected to have a good conversation across these boundaries. And I think all of the panelists are admirers of this book like I am, but I hope in the good spirit of debate, we're going to get a little back and forth and perhaps a little argument. With that said, welcome. Let me tell participants, the authors are going to speak, then the panelists will speak one after another, talk about the book, their reaction to it. There will be some back and forth between the panelists and the authors, and then we will open it up to general questions. The way that will work, and we're all unfortunately very good at Zoom these days, is for y'all participants, attendees, to use the raise hand feature. And fair warning, when you do that, I'll start at the top and go in order. I will promote you to panelist and everybody will see your face when you ask your question or make your comment, okay? So with all of that said, let me hand it over to both Professors Storey and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Chris Blackwell, for that very generous introduction, and let me thank in advance my colleagues Eunice Kim, David Fink, and Aaron Simmons for their responses to our book. Although I maybe I should thank them later after I've heard what they have to say. So we start the book, and actually also thank you all for being here. All the everybody who's come to see this. We're heartened by your interest in our work. So we start the book by telling the story of a student who has done everything that a university like Furman asks of her, only better. She's completed a couple of majors. She's been on study abroad twice. She's the president of one club. She's the treasurer of another. And yet, as graduation approaches, she seems directionless, inwardly frantic and outwardly paralyzed, like a frightened animal who does not know which way to jump. Student is restless, almost panicked, and profoundly unhappy. She's not an isolated case. Indeed, we've observed this phenomenon so many times that we've come to expect it, particularly of outstanding students, typically during the fall of their senior year. Why, we've asked ourselves, are people who are both lucky and deserving, who have successfully put together varied and interesting college lives, so anxious and discontent as their educations culminate? Why are people who are externally enviable inwardly desperate? The frequency with which we encounter this problem caused us to think that it is not just the problem of particular students, but something systemic. We began to suspect that the standards we set are not helpful, that we're encountering an institutional failure in our basic educational mission in guiding young people to live good lives. Our summer teaching, in which we work with students from around the country, showed us that this is not just a Furman problem. It's endemic among students from small colleges and great universities alike. Observing, reading, and reflecting showed us that it's not just a college problem, although it is particularly apparent in this transitional period of life. The problem of restlessness is a problem that we see in ourselves in Ben and Jenna Storey. It's a problem, we think, that is endemic to American culture. Indeed, Alexis De Tocqueville described what we're seeing already in the 1830s. On his famous visit to America, he described those who were most enjoying the fruits of American freedom and opportunity as restless in the midst of their prosperity. Such restlessness is not even just an American problem. Tocqueville saw it so acutely precisely because he was part of a French tradition of thinking about restlessness, the tradition of the so-called moralistes, a word that can be translated as observers of men, a tradition that stretches back to the 16th century origins of the modern era. The restlessness that we're interested in this book is a problem coextensive with modern life. The moralistes knew that restlessness is in some ways native to human life and not just modern life. But modern restlessness has a particular character, epitomized by the anxiety and love of distraction many of us know all too well. So why do modern people become restless and anxious in precisely this distracted way? We argue that modern restlessness is an unintended consequence of a way of living designed as a remedy to the psychopolitical problems of the era of conflict in which the modern world was born. So, the problems of pre modern European life culminated in the wars of religion of the 16th century, and the specter of the cruelty and fanaticism of that age has haunted the modern imagination ever since. Much of modern political thought speaks to that problem, as one can see in perusing the pages of political thinkers from Thomas Hobbes and John Locke to Jean Jacques Rousseau and Immanuel Kant. Everybody is worried about the problem of fanaticism. We begin by focusing on a writer who's less well known to Americans, but who preoccupied the modern imagination for centuries and was read and internalized by many of the most influential thinkers of modern times. This writer was treasured by Francis Bacon and René Descartes, some of the forefathers of modern science. He was assiduously studied by John Locke, Friedrich Nietzsche, and many more of the most important modern philosophers. Poets and writers such as William Shakespeare, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Virginia Woolf borrowed from him and celebrated him. His name is Michel de Montaigne, and he is the 16th century inventor of the literary form known as the essay. Montaigne wrote 3 semi-autobiographical volumes of essays, which became some of the most widely read books in Europe during the crucial period of the 17th and 18th centuries. Indeed, he was read by almost all educated people in that era. Montaigne articulated a new way of thinking about ourselves that would help give rise to new ways of thinking about everything else, from science to religion to politics. Montaigne is the emblematic figure of the Renaissance in France. He lived through 30 years of religious war and had friends and family in every camp during France's nasty and confusing 3-way wars of religion. Those wars touched him directly. A war party once invaded the courtyard of his chateau. Another time, he was taken hostage, robbed, and nearly executed while he was out riding along the highway. And through it all, Montaigne kept his signature cool. Indeed, keeping one's cool is Montaigne's most important moral and intellectual quality. He calls it nonchalance and taking nothing too seriously. And he celebrates that nonchalance in a famous meditation on his own mortality. He writes, "I want death to find me planting my cabbages, but nonchalant about it, and still more about my unfinished garden." And he creates an entire way of living and thinking that reflects this nonchalance. So the problem of Montaigne's time, when human beings were burning one another alive over arguments about the meanings of pronouns endowed with religious significance, was to contain the fanatical passion for the transcendent, for God and the good. A dose of Montaignian nonchalance looked like just what his contemporaries needed to deal with this problem. So Montaigne has a two-pronged approach to checking fanaticism and advancing nonchalance. First, he makes an enormously powerful case for skepticism, for doubt about our own convictions, for the inability of the human mind to reach answers about God, the world, and how we should live. For centuries before Montaigne, philosophers have been arguing about the highest good, the summum bonum, and had come up with at least 288 different answers to the question of just what the summum bonum is. So Montaigne catalogs this enormous variety of opinions about how we should live, along with the often comical mores of the philosophers who advance them, from Thales, the astronomer, who tumbles into a well while he is stargazing, to Diogenes the cynic, who makes his home in a barrel. These people who take themselves so seriously don't deserve, Montaigne suggests, to be taken seriously by the rest of us. And Montaigne's satire of the philosophers is intended to apply with at least equal force to theologians. So that's the intellectual case Montaigne makes for skepticism. Second, Montaigne he offers us a beguiling description of a life lived without transcendent concerns, a life dedicated to what my wife and I call immanent contentment. He assures us that we can safely give up on the question of the summum bonum, of the highest good, and live a life of humble yet satisfying existential indifference. Montaigne makes this convincing by painting a portrait of himself living just such a life that is at once self-centered and attractive. So Montaigne's particular way of pursuing happiness is to circumscribe his desires, as he puts it, to within the circle of the nearest and most contiguous good things. He makes an art of enjoying everyday life. So Montaigne enjoys his pursuits and his pleasures, but he doesn't see any of the things that he enjoys as a gateway to the transcendent. Taking nothing too seriously means that he doesn't expect anything to perfect him or to save him. So he reads, but without the ambition of the scholar. He travels, but without the pride of the explorer or the hope of the pilgrim. He has love affairs and eventually a family, but he doesn't expect too much from either. He grows his own vegetables, but he's perfectly content to leave his garden imperfect. So Montaigne's formula for the good life is moderation through variation. He echoes the ancient adage of moderation, nothing too much, but softens it with a modern corollary, nothing too little. He presents us with a life he calls sensually intellectual and intellectually sensual, without the partiality that characterizes so many of the ways of life celebrated by the classical and Christian traditions that he inherited. So the partiality of those ways of life is captured in the gospel's challenge to us to seek the pearl of great price, the one thing needful that can perfect and sanctify our lives. Montaigne thinks we have no hope of finding any such pearl, and that we can get along well enough without it. Montaigne's book has retained its influence in part because it seems to open the door to the diversity, the individualism, and the toleration so many of us prize. But even more importantly, Montaigne's book spells out the consequences of the skepticism the modern mind feels compelled to adopt in theory for how we live in practice. So that train of consequences runs, if we cannot know the highest good, then it makes sense to sample a little from all the goods that modern life makes available to us, from professional accomplishments to pleasures of the palate. Moderation through variation is a powerful formula for the modern way of pursuing happiness. Okay, I'll turn it over to the other Dr. Storey.
Hi. So I'd like you to think about what my husband just said for a minute. Moderation through variation, the Montaignean formula for happiness. Don't you see something like that at work in your own life? It's going to look a little different for you, of course, because Montaigne was an aristocrat. He had a lifetime of leisure kind of stretching out before him. He had a blank canvas on which to paint a portrait of a highly interesting life. You've got 4 short but precious years of leisure here at Furman, between being under your parents' roof and making it on your own, in which to try to engage in something like the variety of pursuits and pleasures that made Montaigne's life so attractive. Because most people in democratic societies have to work for a living, we have less time and consequently more pressure to achieve that kind of Montaignean multifaceted balance. But we do something like it all the same. So whereas Montaigne liked to de-stress in the afternoons by galloping around in the fields on his horse, you might be trying to squeeze in an hour of yoga or body fit or something between your lab and the dining hall. Montaigne spent much of his life, many years, aspiring for a coveted position at the court. You're going to rush PICAP or run for SGA. Don't you have an interest in health, but also in pleasure, in achievements and honors, but also in walks around the lake and being a stranger during study abroad? You might want a family, but you'll still want me time. You'll hope to have coffee with friends and dancing on the weekends, and perhaps some kids and a garden of your own someday. And like Montaigne, don't you worry sometimes about becoming too fanatical about any one thing? Have you ever found yourself trying to be reasonable and moderate each thing you do by making room for others? So you go to Aikido, but also a cappella, and you make sure to put in some hours with the Heller Service Corps. Americans seem to think that we can dabble our way to happiness. We're always looking for just the right balance of good things that will make us content. Now, my husband and I were led to see this about ourselves when we read as undergraduates, although we were in different institutions, we each read as undergraduates Alexis De Tocqueville's great psychological examination of modern life in his masterwork, Democracy in America. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Tocqueville, why he took interest in Americans, and what I think he can show us about ourselves. Tocqueville was born to a family of French aristocrats in 1805. which if you think about it for a minute, is a very interesting time to be born into a family of French aristocrats. It's only 16 years after the beginning of the French Revolution. And indeed, that revolution hit his family particularly hard. His parents were about the student's age, about 21, 22, when the revolution began, and they were thrown into prison and slated for execution. They watched their friends and their family members being taken out one by one from the cell and guillotined. Now, they were luckily spared. There were frequent changes in revolutionary government, and one of them inexplicably let the young Tocquevilles go. But they were marked by that experience, as you might understand, for the rest of their lives. So Tocqueville's father's hair was perfectly white when he came out of prison, although still in his early 20s. His mother had a kind of nervous tic that lasted the rest of her life. Now you can understand, you can imagine why people who went through this experience were understandably longing to return to the old regime. They might not like this new democratic order in France. And his parents had quite a bit of sympathy, and a lot of people around Tocqueville, his milieu, had that kind of sympathy. But Tocqueville broke with several of his friends and family members over these issues, in part because he was interested in playing a part in post-revolutionary politics in France, and he thought that the future in France was going to be democratic. In fact, the future in the modern West, he thought, was going to be democratic. And so if you wanted to shape the future, you had to learn about democracy. So democracy in Tocqueville's eyes was an inevitable part of the future, but it wasn't inevitably good. He thought its social and political tendencies had to be more carefully studied and more deeply thought through in order to bring out its best sides and minimize its worst. In particular, he saw that democracy could both contribute to and cramp human flourishing, or our quest for happiness. And in the end, this is the topic he's most interested in thinking about. So the young Tocqueville was motivated to study democracy, and particularly to explore democracies where they existed around the world. He looked for a chance to come to America to study what he thought was a particularly advanced or well-developed democracy in the time. And he got his chance in 1831 when the French government wanted to send a few people here to study our prison system. At the time, it was thought to be very modern and humane. The Quakers had reformed it, and it compared very favorably to the dungeons of France. So they sent Tocqueville, they sponsored Tocqueville and his friend, Gustave du Beaumont, to come to America. And they spent 18 months here in this country. While they were here, they did all the traditional kind of touristy things of the 1830s. They took a trip on a steamboat, they spent a night in a log cabin, but they were doing all of this while having an eye on the inner life of the American people. They were kind of exquisitely attentive to our inner psychological workings, tuned in to how the modern democracy they found in operation here affected the way we think about ourselves and our quest for happiness. So we characterize, my husband and I in our book, we characterize what Tocqueville saw in America as a kind of democratized Montanism, a Montanism writ large and reformulated. Once it was a kind of boutique, countercultural, aristocratic pursuit when Montaigne carved it out. But in Tocqueville's time in the United States, in a fully developed democracy, it had become something that could serve as the standard way of life for a whole country. So how are Americans, in Tocqueville's eyes, like Montagnans? First and foremost, like Montaigne, Americans are skeptics, according to Tocqueville. We don't like to take things on authority, right? Even the word authority makes us cringe. We're particularly skeptical that anyone has worked out the question of how to live, what to devote your life to, in any way that should command our attention. Even asking the standard question that was once frequently asked by ancient philosophers, what is the best way to live, kind of grates on our nerves, or maybe just doesn't compute. For how could any life be lived better than any other? Aren't all the things to which we could devote ourselves, jobs, bank accounts, politics, family, arts, pleasures, service, knowledge, God, aren't these basically of equal worth? And even if maybe they aren't, who's going to judge? How can anyone know for certain anything about what will make us happy? Because Americans usually wish to answer these questions for themselves, and also to consider everyone's answer to these questions equally valid, they're not inclined to take a lot of time to read about the ways great minds in the past thought systematically about the question. Ignorant of the history of philosophy, they're condemned, Tocqueville points out, to repeat it unwittingly. And so they don't know that they have essentially unquestioningly inherited their skepticism about the question of what can make a human being happy from dead white guys like Descartes, Voltaire, and Montaigne. As my husband mentioned, Montaigne tried to convince people that it's ridiculous to ask the question of the summum bonum, the greatest good, the one thing needful that will make life worth living. He did this because he thought that if we just didn't think about these exalted questions, we'd be happier in the here and now. If we didn't entertain extravagant ideas about what would completely satisfy our restless human souls, we might be more content. If we refused to let our minds be preoccupied with questions of God or the ultimate good, we'd be liberated to enjoy all the little pleasures we overlook when we're setting our sights too high. But what Tocqueville shows in Democracy in America is that lowering our expectations turns out not to be a particularly good way of avoiding discontent. Confining our sights to attainable goods doesn't actually give us reasonable hopes. In fact, it makes us crazy in our own particular way. So how is this? In a particularly memorable chapter, one of our favorites in Democracy in America, Montaigne essentially traces the decline of the Montaignian soul. He shows us there how the quest to find contentment in worldly goods begins full of optimism and energy, but then gets mired in distraction and tangled up in a kind of fruitless restlessness, and often ends in despair. Why? As soon as you set your sights on worldly rewards, Tocqueville points out, the clock by which you are able to enjoy them starts ticking. And so you'd like to lose yourself in the pleasure of the moment, but you can't help but be conscious of the fact that life has a span, and that span is short. And therefore, the time to enjoy your pleasures is limited. This makes us anxious. And we start pestering ourselves with questions like, have I sampled everything there is to sample here? Have I moved quickly enough to fit it all in before I'm old and boring? Am I as famous as I should be? Is there maybe a shortcut, a quick route to success and satisfaction I maybe have missed? Americans are restless. We change out our cars, our homes, our jobs, our wives in a constant effort to have it all now. And so we behave in a very strange and characteristic way. We cling to the goods of this world, Tocqueville points out, as if those goods could be enjoyed forever. And yet we scurry around, we're frantic, we can't help but try to grasp the next thing. And that kind of betrays or shows that we have a secret awareness that death could catch up to us at any moment and rob us of the pleasures of our possession. Worse still, the goods that we desire seem more or less possible to attain because they're not as exalted as those that Montaigne was trying to distract us from. And this makes us think that we should be able to achieve happiness. Therefore, we assume that happiness is kind of the default way to be, not a rare achievement, as ancient authors like Aristotle would have thought. Consequently, there's a kind of social pressure to be happy, or at least seem happy. The suffering of the unhappy is then compounded by the guilt of feeling like a moral failure. And this is what leads us to despair, Tocqueville says. The American case shows what it's like to try to confine the human imagination to the immanent sphere, as Montaigne had hoped to do. It doesn't solve the human problem, it just kind of covers it up. Even if we recognize this, though, it's hard for people living in busy modern democracies to break out of the pattern. Our lives are kind of geared to encourage us to chase after these superficial goods. Even the things we cherish most about our country, equality, mobility, opportunity, pressure us toward this chase. For superficial goods are, in the end, some of the most tangible markers we have. They're what help people who live in an unusually fluctuating, flexible, kind of fluid society define themselves. We treasure the things we can buy because they display the results of our labor and the particularities of our taste. We cling to lines on our resumes with great enthusiasm. They seem to be indications of kind of hard-earned existential worth. We do this even more desperately when we become more detached from the traditional inherited markers of who we are, when we leave our hometowns, become distant from our families, whether personally or just geographically, when we leave the profession of our fathers or the church of our mothers. All of this makes us tend to reach toward these more inherently transient goods in an effort to fix our identities. So I hope by this point in our lecture, you might be thinking this is a problem. But you also might be doubting that it's a problem of first order importance. Because what we're talking about is the unhappiness of those who have it all. And by definition, that's the unhappiness of very fortunate people. It's a problem of very fortunate people. And therefore a problem we should be maybe grateful to have. Sometimes you'll hear people calling such problems first world problems, which means that they're problems we have the luxury to obsess over because we don't have to worry about where we'll get our next meal. Calling things first world problems is usually a way of saying there are other more pressing problems to which we should be directing our most serious attention. And while it's absolutely true, there are many other serious problems that we need to think about, it doesn't seem wise to me to overlook the problems of the first world, as they're called. It's true that restless unhappiness is a problem that plagues the elites more obviously than others. But what plagues the privileged plagues the world. For the privileged, by definition, are our leaders. Whether it's just or not, their aspirations, their hopes, their troubles, their problems shapes everybody's lives. That our elites are restless and disoriented is everyone's problem. For we're all in trouble if we have a bunch of directionless people at the helm. Secondly, and no less important, the disorientation of our young people is a shame in itself, and it leads to great personal suffering. More than a third of college-aged people report being depressed. As one of my students mentioned to me just the other day, the second leading cause of death among people aged 15 to 34 is suicide. We know this is a problem, of course, and we try to fix it. We try to treat it. We hire more counselors, we develop better drugs. These attempts to heal are certainly important, and in many cases, even life-saving. But what my husband and I would like us to consider is that they might be like Band-Aids that we keep buying more of without ever having enough. They might be like medicines that treat the symptoms of the problem rather than the root. In our view, the root of this problem is that the way we pursue happiness is making us unhappy. So what might we do about that? I'm going to focus this afternoon on a few things we might do in the context of a liberal arts university, since that's what many of us have in common in the audience, and something that we might be able to work on together. I have a thought for students, a thought for faculty, and a thought for those who set the framework of university life. So for students, recognize that 4 years at a university like Furman can be a precious pause at the threshold of adult life. You can use this time to examine seriously and systematically the different things to which people have devoted themselves. And you can use this time to make an effort to judge among them, because you will need to judge. You will need to choose one for yourself. You will have to distinguish what is merely nice from what is needful, the optional accessories from the worthy crowns of a life. Now, students often try to seek a balance among all their interests and activities. Instead, you might think of concentrating on those relationships, experiences, and classes that will help you unravel the mystery of your own soul, and let the other things just fall by the wayside. Don't be afraid to rank and order your aspirations and your experiences, and turn away from those that don't contain the answer to the decisive human question: what will make you happy? As a mortal, rational animal, you were not born to sample, but to choose. So for faculty, I think it would be helpful if we thought more carefully about our role in assisting young people make these choices. Now, professors in general haven't chosen the most lucrative profession and therefore are generally fairly comfortable counseling students away from consumer culture and from thinking that the value of an education or anything else can be measured with a dollar sign. But do we do well enough at guiding our students toward alternative ways of thinking? Do we give them the intellectual and moral resources to make hard choices among competing attractions? So I don't want this to be understood as a call for more UQ ultimate questions classes, which would be self-interested. That's what I teach. That's what my husband teaches. I think this isn't a project that's confined to the humanities or the social sciences. I think actually each department and discipline in the university can play a part in this effort. Health and exercise science, for example, has a role to play, and it's a key role because they train the body to face physical hardship. And when you do that, you effectively train your mind to have persistence and courage. Music, the visual arts, also very important. They tune the soul to recognize beauty and to desire beautiful rewards of effort. It was once obvious to people that math and logic were fundamental to a liberal education. Why? Because they train the mind to recognize hard and fast truths. They train the mind to recognize the necessary, things that can't be plausibly denied once you see it. I think we could rediscover the kind of unity that is appropriate to a university by understanding the different disciplines as ways to cultivate the mind and character necessary to pursue a liberal education, which properly understood, in my view, is an education in the art of choosing. So finally, to those who shape the framework of a university. It's important to understand that in order to choose wisely, people need the time to think. A liberal arts institution has an essential function to play in a democracy, and it's a countercultural function. And that's to be an island of patience in a culture of haste. Everything the university does should be geared so as to prefer careful thought to slapdash opinion. This is our most essential public service. So in conclusion, let me be clear about one thing that we're saying in the book and to you all. We think that Montaigne had good reason to try to doctor to his age, to try to tamp down its fanaticism, to tend to its problems by trying to articulate a way in which we could be satisfied with nothing more than ordinary life, life lived within the circle of immanent contentment. But Montaigne's cure has become our disease. It turns out that immanence can be as mad a master as transcendence had been. We are now living by a script formulated to meet the crisis of a vastly different age. To meet the new world before us with the inventiveness it requires to figure out how to live well, we'll have to be as thoughtful and as daring as the thinkers we examine in this book. Only then might we help to turn our pointless busyness into a pointed quest. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay. This is great. Lots of things to think about. I see that we have actually one hand raised and then one question in the Q&A. We're going to wait on those until the panelists have spoken, but I'm kind of keeping track of in what order they will appear in. And so, Caden Perry, remember your question and you'll get to ask it at the end. And likewise, Alex Hurt, you've got, I think, a very thoughtful question in there. Maybe ones that show up in the Q&A, I will read, right? Because I know our authors like to answer a face and not a text box. So we'll just hang on to those. It's great. I'm delighted to see those already in there. So on to our first scholar and humanist and colleague and friend who's going to respond to this, these ideas. So Dr. Eunice Kim is assistant professor of classics at Furman. Her scholarship includes the linguistics of the ancient Greek language and its ancestor languages, heroes of Greek epic poetry, especially the most murderous ones, and innovative foreign language pedagogy. She was most recently awarded a very prestigious National Humanities Center Summer Residency Fellowship. And so with that, we're delighted to have Dr. Kim join us, and I'll hand it over.
Thank you for the introduction, and really thank you for the opportunity to read this exciting book. And I'm equally excited to be a part of this panel. And I just want to share like a message I received maybe an hour before this was supposed to occur. Many of the students in attendance here are just stoked because they envision this as the infinity war of CLPs, which is just like a funny formulation about what we might be doing right now. Where my first thought is it antagonistic, agonistic? And for me, I'm very much not that kind of person, let's say. However, I think actually that's a valuable way of conceptualizing the way we're going to respond to your book, Jenna and Ben Storey, where we each have a particular point of view informed by our areas of interest and expertise to some extent. And so I have learned so much about the way our restlessness has been informed by this French tradition and understanding of formulating happiness. And so for now, what I'd like to do is just share that ancient Greek, and to be sorry to shortchange the Romans, but I'm more of a Hellenist, but share that ancient Greek perspective about what is restlessness, happiness, and how that might map onto, anticipate, and even challenge your answer to why we are restless. So I have slides, And I apologize for the bareness of this set. I promise you, you have a much exciting one in conclusion to the series of panelists here today. So as a classical philologist, someone who studies the ancient Greek and Roman languages, whenever I try to address a problem, I always like to look at the roots of a language. For me, I can kind of get my bearings in terms of definitions very much in a Socratic tradition of first exploring what a word means and using that as a point of access to the larger question at hand. So that's what I like to do. I'd like to explore further these terms we've used, restlessness and happiness, and what kind of terms are used in the Greek tradition in particular. So based off my reading of the book, restlessness, I understand as a sense of discontentment, perhaps unhappiness, the antithesis of happiness, whereas happiness then is a state of human flourishing, let's say, and feel free to expand upon those early definitions. Now, as I was reading and preparing for my remarks on this book, I struggled to find that Greek conception of restlessness. I was trying to find a way in which that exact idea of having less rest or having an absence of a state of peace of mind, how that might manifest in the language of the ancient Greeks. And ironically, in a state of sleeplessness just last night, where I thought, oh, I might not find that word, in the end, I found it. And by the way, just to emphasize this etymology, the absence of rest, I did find the Greek term, which is tarake, literally meaning a disturbance or trouble. And I think the reason why I struggled to come upon that word in the first place is actually the negation of that particular word is more recognizable, giving us the very important philosophical term, autodoxia, which if you've taken early Greek philosophy classes is supremely important in the Hellenistic philosophical tradition of 3rd century BCE Greece. So quite literally, ataraxia, well, loosely is often translated as tranquility, calmness, but more literally, an absence of disturbance, freedom from distress and anxiety. So what's interesting about the ancient context is this notion of lacking in absence is reversed, right? Where the Greek tradition wants to emphasize freedom from that disturbance, whereas Ben and Jenna Stories has emphasized our absence or withholding from pure state of ease, let's say. Okay. Now, ataraxia is still similarly linked to our to a notion of happiness in the ancient Greek tradition. The level of disturbance we feel is directly correlated in some way to the amount of happiness we might achieve and attain, which is interesting. But with that emphasis on the opposite kind of absence, what interestingly the Greek tradition does is that it does signal a sense of choice in terms of how we might achieve happiness in the Greek tradition, where it's not a matter of seeking happiness in itself. Happiness is rather defined by an avoidance of negative values, let's say. And for me, that suggests then there is a notion of choice in the hierarchy of values in order to feel better about human flourishing or the way we are living our lives, interestingly enough. Now, and I'm going to be very quick in my remarks so that we can get on to the fun part of exchanging ideas and sparring if we need be. But so that's the idea of Greek restlessness. Now, the other word I wanted to highlight is, of course, Greek happiness. And that's more difficult because there are so many terms that might refer to this idea of human flourishing: Eudaimonia, Eutoukia, Makariotes, and Olbos. And each of those are actually very important resonant terms. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on the first one, Eudaimonia, because it is the term most often used in juxtaposition with this notion of ataraxia. where if you have achieved a state of no disturbance in your life, you have eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, right? But more literally, looking at the roots that make up this word in ancient Greek, it means good daimon, a good god, good spirit. In the sense that, and daimon, by the way, gives us later English demon, but that's a later development. But anyways, what that might suggest about happiness in the ancient Greek perspective is that it is a state of being in which you are possessed by a good spirit, right? What that might suggest is what Ben and Jenna suggested earlier about this more transcendent point of view or perspective about how happiness is defined in the ancient tradition, as opposed to the more imminent perspective we get in the tradition of the French moralists. Okay. But what I want to further emphasize is actually with this etymology, the idea of human happiness, of human flourishing, is actually related to it is something outside of the human self. It's related to divine favor and fortune. But what's very interesting is this common correlation between one's happiness and the vicissitudes of life, which one does not necessarily have control over. Where happiness is a circumstance of whatever else is going on in the world. If circumstances are fortunate, then you are happy. If they are not, then you are unhappy. And so I bring up this point to show that the ancient Greeks recognize this dichotomy of control between what we as humans have control over and what we do not. And so it's coming to terms with what we can and cannot control that contributes to their understanding of how we might achieve human flourishing. Now, this might seem irrelevant to later and more modern English definitions of happiness, but I do want to emphasize the fact that that English term we use, happiness, is related to the notion of chance. It is etymologically related to similar cognate words of happenstance, to happen, something that occurs, haphazard, where again, we might not think about it, we just use this word, but really the underlying nuance again is that happiness is somewhat linked to something that we ourselves have no choice or control over. Okay. And so this is a tradition of thought that the French moralists themselves would have been somewhat steeped in and were perhaps responding to. And I wonder, just as a general way of encouraging debate, is that question of how much our sense of choice in a world where we might not actually have that choice complicates your answer to why we are restless, and the fact that people nowadays have an excess of options that might paralyze them from actually choosing something. And Professor Storey, Jenna Storey, I loved your answer or definition of education as the art of choosing. And so wondering then about what about those situations in which we cannot have a choice. So finally, one last remark is that a completely separate word for happiness, but equally important, is olbos. And that is hard, it's pre-Greek, so it's hard to actually linguistically recover what it originally meant, but its contextual usage is very illuminating. And perhaps one of the most famous statements, not in the Greek philosophical tradition, but in the Greek historical tradition, is said in book 1 of Herodotus' his histories, where the great sage Solon tells a Lydian king named Croesus, who has it all, by the way. He's that guy who just has attained every luxury, every good, has never lost in life, and frankly believes that he is the most happy, blessed man. But Solon says, no, I don't count you among my top 2, because he says, count no man as happy, olbios, a different conceptualization of happiness, before he dies. We don't know true happiness until there is an end that is known. And so a final question I'd like to pose then is, the standards or criteria by which we recognize happiness and the parameters or limits within which we can identify that. So like I said, I'll keep my that's the end of my remarks, and I'm looking forward to these responses to my questions, and I'll just stop sharing.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Kim. And I'll point out the 1603 English translation of Montaigne punts on this word for restlessness and uses ataraxy as an English word. So that's awesome. Excellent. So our next speaker, our next respondent, Dr. David Fink is Associate Professor of Religion at Furman University. His scholarship extends broadly across the history of Christianity and Christian thought from antiquity to modernity. And he has special expertise in late medieval and early modern Europe, the history of biblical interpretation and biblical scholarship, Dante, Christianity and warfare, wealth and poverty in Christian thought and practice, modernity and secularization. He has published widely across all of these interests and has a forthcoming commentary on the biblical books of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. So I will turn it over to Dr. Fink.
Thank you, Dr. Blackwell. Thanks to all of our panelists for participating in this. As I've been listening to the remarks, I've also been sneaking a peek occasionally at the almost 300 participants we have for this event, and many of whom are alumni of Furman University and students who both I and both Dr. Storey have had in class. Students who we've known and loved through the years, and I think it's really testimony to the community that you've built here that these folks are coming back to hear about your book and to stay in touch and to stay current with your work. So this is really an exciting event to be a part of. Ben and Jenna, I'd just like to start off by expressing my gratitude and admiration for what you've done here. This is a beautiful book. It's written with clarity and elegance of expression. And I think you've shown us here what good teachers in the humanities do best. We initiate students into some of the most consequential conversations about what it means to be human. And we model for them how to read texts like this, not just to pick them apart or to fit them into the latest critical theories, but how to read for wisdom. Now, Ben, I know the conception for this book came in large part from the first year seminar that you've taught here at Furman for many years now. And as I was reading it, I would often imagine you triumphantly stabbing the pages of well-worn Penguin editions with your finger, by turns exalting and then humbling your students until they comprehend that they are incomprehensible monsters. And Jenna, I know much of the intellectual breadth and timeliness of this project are owing to the work you've done over the years in creating space for intellectual hospitality through the Tocqueville program here at Furman. In short, I think this book models the kind of patient search for wisdom among the shades of the dead that I aspire to in my own teaching and scholarship, and I enjoyed reading it immensely. I learned a lot from this book. To begin with, I was reintroduced to 4 authors with whom I had only a passing familiarity from my days as an undergraduate philosophy student. Montaigne and Rousseau were still canonical in those days, but Pascal was already a footnote, especially at the militantly secular state university where I attended. And Tocqueville simply wasn't doing real philosophy. So I think one of the most striking contributions of your argument in this book is how you've brought the 4 of them into conversation. Or rather, you've shown that the latter 3 were all responding in different ways to Montaigne's conception of immanent contentment. So what I think your book does, and does really well, is situate that shift in philosophical anthropology, philosophical account of what it means to be human, and the controversy it continues to generate at the heart of what we call modernity. Is human life best lived on the horizontal plane, making do with homely pleasures like a cat lying in the sun? Or will we always be restless without a transcendent aim point, an animating purpose that lifts our gaze beyond self-regard? Watching Pascal, Rousseau, and Tocqueville each try on different answers gives us a master class in how to be a student of human nature. And it makes me wish that I'd had this FYW when I was a freshman. But the book, as I understand it, goes beyond philosophically sophisticated self-help to engage a major political question. And that's where I want to ask some friendly/critical questions. One of the major subtexts of the book seems, on my reading, to be the inadequacy of a political order that is calibrated solely to immanent contentment in nurturing any strong sense of transcendent meaning. In other words, you seem to be arguing that if we don't build these transcendent aims into our politics at the institutional level, we'll inevitably end up walling them out of our personal lives as well. As such, this book seems to fit into an emerging subgenre of studies aimed at diagnosing a purported crisis of liberalism. Now, these books all, it seems to me, make the case that in one form or another, as a society that leaves individuals free to determine their own ends, ultimately ends up enforcing a rather narrow and constricting view of what it means to be human. A way of life that leads ineluctably to the kind of restlessness you describe so incisively in this book. These critiques seem to place immanent contentment and transcendent yearning in a position of inescapable conflict. The monk seeking union with God in the desert and the cat-like bourgeois sunning himself on the back patio need not be implacable enemies on this view, but they can never ultimately coexist as citizens on equal terms in anything resembling a just or coherent polity. Now, you can count me as part of the tribe of Pascal in acknowledging the inadequacy of Montaigne's version of immanent contentment. Moreover, Pascal is surely right in affirming that, quote, the soul demands more of politics than politics can ever deliver. And that's your very pithy summary of Pascal at that point. But this insight, it seems to me, is in point of fact an argument for limiting the reach of the political, rather than stretching it out toward those very transcendent ends. The Augustinian tradition, of which Pascal was the inheritor, always had a certain limited view of the role of the city of man, as Augustine puts it in his great work of the early 5th century. A polity that is oriented solely to temporal or secular ends. But this has never prevented Christian theorists from cooperating in the pursuit and defense of those goods. If it is true, as Thomas Aquinas argues in the High Middle Ages, that grace does not destroy nature, but perfects it, then it must follow that the Christian aim to transcend human nature need not obviate the more earthbound ambitions of our Montaignian neighbors to find their warm spot in the sun. And so I want to ask you to help me understand a bit more why you seem to be more worried that we can't make this liberal order work, that we can't keep muddling along with conflicting or at least just different transcendent aims. Why is it not enough to seek transcendent meaning as individuals or as members of localized community of like-minded fellow travelers? Why do we need a political framework in place to facilitate these ends and to give them the force of law? Thanks again for a great book and for a stimulating conversation, and I look forward to hearing back from you in the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David. I'm looking forward to the answers to these questions. It's going to be great. Our third and final respondent, before we get the rebuttal from our authors, is Dr. Aaron Simmons. He holds a PhD from Vanderbilt University and is a professor of philosophy here at Furman. He has authored over 100 articles, book chapters, interviews, or reviews, and authored or edited numerous books, including God and the Other, Kierkegaard's God and the Good Life, Phenomenology for the 21st Century, and Re-examining Deconstruction and Determinate Religion. Aaron is the current president of the Soren Kierkegaard Society, former president of the South Carolina Society for Philosophy, and has served on the boards for the Society for Christian Philosophers and the Society for Continental Philosophy and Theology. So welcome, Dr. Simmons.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blackwell. Before I share my screen and get into the presentation, let me just say one of my true joys being at Furman is having Ben and Jenna as colleagues. I can say honestly that there is no one I would rather have a hand go up from when I'm giving a talk than Ben, and there's no one I would rather come over and say, do you mind if I get on the treadmill next to you because I want to think with you about liberalism than Jenna. So I am better because of being in community with the two of you. You make me smarter because you humble me every time we speak together. I love your book. It's the kind of book I wish I could write. And maybe one day, if I try really hard, I will. I loved, Chris, your analysis that this is the last mile. It's an existential book, not merely a historical one, and full of wisdom. I encourage it to everyone. That said, I also am a philosopher, and I think Socrates is right when he says the way that we care for the soul of another is by offering criticism. So because I've only got 8 minutes, my plan is to offer a critical engagement, which I think is hopefully constructive in the fact that maybe Ben and Jenna will respond by saying, look, everything you said we already agree with, you're just a poor reader. So I fully leave that option available. So let me pull up this little presentation just so we've got something to look at here. And I think that one of the really compelling things to me about the way that Ben and Jenna, you all are professors, is that you are, and I've told Jenna this many, many times, you are the only people other than the coaches on our campus who can tell students we need you to be there at 5 a.m. and they will show up. Meanwhile, I give extra credit and my students say, meh. So what I'm going to do is actually try to pick at this idea of precisely what makes you so compelling, so engaging to our students and also to your colleagues. So let's go to church. I think that this book ultimately offers the following sermon. It's basically a critique of modernity, the project of modernity. And it says that restlessness threatens to overwhelm our happiness despite our successes. This happens at personal and political levels. And ultimately, the claim is that we have been too enamored by this imminent contentment, which has led to emptiness. It can't be fulfilled by going deeper in immanence, but instead we've got to turn to, as David, you said, verticality as the resource, some sort of escape from the modern liberal project if we're going to thrive together. Then they offer an altar call, which I think is a quasi pre-modern turn. If modernity's messed up, let's go somewhere else. And I think they go pre-modern. They offer what I take to be 4 recommendations. 1, we need to increase our understanding to realize that the immanent frame is cracking. They call for awareness, that we read more old books in order to gain the wisdom of the ancients to navigate where we are. They encourage existential training as a way of rethinking higher education. And they then defend metaphysical commitment, which is the turn to transcendence as the key to overcoming this malaise that plagues all of the moderns. I'm a Pentecostal, so to this I say amen. Yes, reading old books is almost always a good idea. And I went back and reread C.S. Lewis's essay on the reading of old books, where he similarly makes a case for why this is so important. And the case he makes is that it helps us avoid making the same mistakes, not necessarily that it helps us avoid mistakes. And that's where my hesitation shows up. I worry that there is, in good religious senses, a temptation that underlies the best sermons, and the temptation is a temptation to traditionalism. I really think that we should be wary of confusing an interest in the ancients with an affirmation of traditions as somehow good in themselves. So when they say that the essential equipment for this adventure of solitude is the thought of other times, I say yes, but wait a minute, what do you mean by essential? It does seem like Lewis that this is necessary condition. I worry that it might be presented as a sufficient one. And here I just offer as one example, John Dewey's account of progressive education, where he says, look, if all we do is read old books, as Emerson claims, we become meek young people, rather than becoming the sorts of folks able to navigate the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. So maybe we need to avoid the traditionalism. Again, I say amen. Higher education, yes, has abandoned its identity as a culture creator, because anymore what it has done is become not much more, actually, than a reflection of a dehumanizing economic and scientific logic, whereby we don't invite students to become people who live meaningful lives, but merely invite them to become successful employees who are able to contribute significantly to alumni donor campaigns and US News surveys. Here I would turn to Michel Henry, the French phenomenologist, who writes about the destruction of the university by saying the following: one can take the economic end as sufficient and valuable on its own. To construct the university on this basis is to limit its field or vocation terribly. And if this vocation is culture, which I'm suggesting it is, right? It's a culture creating task. This destroys the university. I think that Ben and Jenna present this case remarkably well, and I say amen. But I worry that it leads to a kind of elitism if we are not careful. The task, the goal, the key is to be a creator. And so when they talk about the impact on students, I worry, I wonder, despite my jealousy of their impact on students, I worry that it still allows students to remain consumers, but now not of this economic logic, but of a particular way or mode of life that we then teach them as professors, being mouthpieces of this ancient wisdom. I wonder, what if we thought about students as enacting apprenticeships in risky personhood? I think this is what the art of choosing invites, but that risk seems lost somehow here. And what if we think about professors as shaping the direction of the conversation, rather than just mapping the path where it has gone before? Again, rather than turning backwards, maybe this turns forward and invites us to then find our voices as we invite our students to find their own. Let everyone say amen. You can hear the organ start vamping behind me here, right? The immanent frame is cracking, yes. And we've got to find some attachment to transcendence if we're going to find the contentment that they describe. As Simon Critchley, Chantal Mouffe, Cornel West, and many others understand, we have a motivational deficit because we have, in the liberal project, grounded relational solidarity in egoism. The interesting thing, though, is all of these thinkers are, in one way or another, defenders of the project of liberalism, which is where I wonder about an absolutist temptation. What do we mean by transcendence in this vertical account? Cribbing on Alistair McIntyre, who's good? Which contentment? Are we talking about realism, essentialism, objectivism, idealism? There's a lot of ways that we could cash out this transcendence. And so when they describe it, my worry is that we do so in a way that then needs us to guard against the traditionalism, elitism, and absolutism that postmodernism helped us understand. And maybe certain trends in pre-modernism invited the modern response that they are rightly critical of. So I wonder if this dichotomy might be a bit false. So ultimately, I say hallelujah anyway. I'm in. But here's my worry. The art of choosing, which I love, it maybe ends up masking an unacknowledged desire that we are able to provide clarity and certainty for our students who are scared of making decisions, and that we try to eliminate that anxiety by offering them stable foundations and transcendent ideals. But maybe Derrida was right when he says that decision is only possible in the face of the undecidable. So as the musicians come forward, here's my conclusion. Maybe postmodernism needs to be where we turn instead. Existential freedom is real, so are the consequences. Kierkegaard was right. Existence is the moment of decision. Epistemic foundations must be revisable. Metaphysical commitments must be hermeneutically framed. So I want my students and my readers to continue to struggle with the task of becoming, but to develop the ability not only to listen to the voices of old books, but find their own voice. Contingency is not the enemy of truth, but the space in which we decide what truth is worth our time and our life. Maybe rest shouldn't be our goal, but rather we should seek an appropriate and singular wakefulness in light of our shared humanity. Embodied existence, then, is not something that admits of clarity and certainty, no matter how much we wish it did, but instead it requires risk and trust. Maybe we will find rest, but not because the winds have calmed down in light of our grasp of transcendent ideals, but because we have realized that we are imminently built to endure these storms. So as we begin the praise break, no. I love the Church of the Stories, but I need to see the faith statement before deciding if I'm going to attend more regularly. Thank you guys so much.
Okay, thank you. All right, I think we are slated to go to 6:30, and I believe in beginning on time and ending on time. So we've got 20 minutes, which is great. I think we would all very much love to hear the Story's response to these like incredibly thoughtful observations and questions and gentle criticisms, or sometimes vigorous criticisms. And then I know we have two outstanding questions from attendees, which it'd be nice to get to as well. And this would be also if anybody else wants to raise a hand, or I see there's another question which I'll look at now. But let me hand it over to our authors.
Let me, is it okay if I start, Jenna? Let me start by just, first of all, thanking David Fink, whose idea this was. We're really grateful to him. And let me thank all four of you. You know, you don't get this kind of level of engagement with something you write every day. This is really wonderful. It will push us to think better, and we're really grateful for all of that. I want to say a quick word of response to what both David is saying, what Aaron is saying, because I think these things are in some ways coming together. I think David has mistaken us for what are sometimes called integralists, the people who think that we should bring back together the church and state. That's not what we think. Actually, what we want to try to point out about the liberal order is that liberal orders rely on a certain sort of citizen. That is, liberal orders were created in eras of very widespread religious belief. And oftentimes a proto-liberal thinker like Montaigne, a truly liberal thinker like Locke, they kind of take that for granted and they seek to box it in so as to create room for other stuff, to create room for imminent concerns. And that's totally sensible coming from where they're coming from. I think what we're trying to say is that if we want to preserve liberalism, we have to remember that we don't live in the 17th century. That is, that we can't take for granted that we live in a society full of people with robustly developed transcendent concerns. And so this is what I think Jenna meant when she said, immanence can prove to be as mad a master as transcendence was. Liberalism is an architecture of separations, and one of those separations is the separation between the transcendent and the immanent, between what you do in church and what you do at the grocery store and in the voting booth. But if for lots and lots of us, one side of that separation is completely hollow, then we end up in a place that is troubling for liberalism. So that's the kind of question that we're trying to raise for people in this book. We're not trying to say that we need to restore the unity of church and state or something like this. Do you want to speak on that? Yeah.
If you're finished with talking to David Fink, can I just put a little, because we've talked about this before, so you've taken most of what I have to say, but just addressing, just to reiterate and address David Fink's question at the end directly, why can't we keep muddling along with different transcendent commitments or something like this? Why do we need a political framework? That muddling along with different transcendental commitments required a political framework, the political framework of liberalism, which is a political framework, and which worked very well when in the conditions under which it was elaborated. But the point of this book is to say, wake up to where we are now.
I'll address Aaron for a minute there. I think Dr. Simmons I very much appreciate everything that he's saying. I think he's significantly overstated the gap between where he is and where we are. As David Fink pointed out, yes, I do love to point at the book and say to my students, if they're exalted, they need to be humbled. If they're humble, they need to be exalted. And they have to be continually contradicted until they comprehend that they're incomprehensible monsters. Our point is not to give people a recipe for exactly how to live, say like, look, here are the commandments, go do it. Our point is to put people in motion. And I think that is the same, that's exactly the ambition that I think Dr. Simmons has described, and rightly described. And we don't think for a moment that that old books contain ready-made recipes which we can just stamp onto our lives. We entirely agree with him that that's not a sensible way to approach things. Now, we might have a somewhat different attitude toward the past because we have a somewhat different analysis of what it means to live in an American democratic society. And this comes from our Tocquevillian point of view. One of the most important things I think Tocqueville points out in Democracy in America is that modern democracies are not like other societies insofar as they reverse a kind of traditional polarity. That is, for most societies, the weight of authority is on the side of tradition. Tradition is understood to be the kind of the default. Think about the way that we talk about the word innovation in a democratic society. We have a default assumption that innovation is good. And so the prejudice is not on the side of the old, the prejudice is on the side of the new. And that's a big part of what it means to live in a modern democracy. So while we point people to old resources, we point people in old resources because we have to understand the conventions of our time and place. And the conventions of our time and place are decidedly presentist in orientation. And so to get out of that presentist orientation, it's useful to step back and see what somebody like Aristotle or Pascal or whoever it is, Kierkegaard, had to say about these kinds of things. Do you have anything? Jenna, would you like to speak to Eunice Kim's questions, or I have a quick response there.
Well, I have a little something to say, so let me.
Sure, go ahead.
Well, I found what I love etymologies, by the way, and so I was really glad that you embarked on that project, and we thought a little bit about eudaimonia in light of our just in casual conversations, but not anywhere near as systematically as you did. And I really liked what you said about eudaimonia, emphasizing the kind of element of, you might have said chance, but I think anything that is not up to you, that part of your pursuit of happiness that comes from elsewhere, right? And I think that is at least in alignment with what we're talking about as a kind of a quest for happiness that recognizes the necessarily transcendent aspect of the human person, right? Because when you engage in a kind of a quest for happiness that acknowledges the transcendent, you can only go so far on your own steam. You're waiting for the world, the universe, God, something out there that transcends you and what you can manipulate or do to respond. So I think that there's a kind of alliance between those two concepts, and that sheds light on, I think, a problem or drawback that one sees when one tries to pursue happiness in a purely immanent way, which is that things of this world can be fundamentally manipulated by us, right? And so we tend to approach our happiness as something that can be organized or manipulated and sort of strategized about, right? And when we don't achieve that, it's like ever the more our fault, or ever the more something that should have been under our control and yet isn't. So I think maybe the word eudaimonia and the concepts associated with it could be a helpful way to think about opening this kind of awareness of ourselves as having a necessarily transcendent dimension.
Excellent. At this moment, there are, I think, 3 open questions from the floor, and we have 11 minutes, which should work. I will read Alex's question. I will let Abigail ask her own, and then John Martin has added another one in the Q&A. While I read Alex's question and let the Dr. Storey answer it, Abigail, I'm going to promote you to panelist, which takes there's a little latency, and then you'll be able to ask your question directly, and then we can get to John's question, and then we'll probably be out of time. All right, so sorry here, multitasking. promoting to panelists. So early on in your discussion, Dr. Storey, Alex Hurt writes, "It sounds like we overestimate how much we enjoy physical goods here in the US, which makes sense to me. We seem to have a focus on a culture of production and consumption, which can cause us to lose focus on the spiritual side of being at peace." And I like this. I love this last sentence. Do you think enjoying something with friends can help balance this out to some extent? I love that question.
Good. Jenna, do you want to take this one?
Oh, well, here I am referring to old books again, and now I'm highly conscious of this after satire of my life, but which I thought was very funny, by the way. Maybe not accurate, but very funny. So the first thing I thought of when I heard that question is what Aristotle says about trying to seek something for its own sake. And there's a number of options there. One of which is when you do something for your friend, it's like you're doing something that's purely free for its own sake. And I think, why is that? It's because another human being is sort of a fount of possibility, a starting point. And when you engage with another human being, you're engaging in this realm of not just absolute freedom, right? But this realm of kind of constructive creativity. And yes, it is an escape from the purely immanent world, because human beings are not purely immanent creatures, even though we might try to be.
I'll just add to that. I also very much like the question. I think one of the things that that a philosopher like Aristotle or many others would point out is that one of the things we do with our friends is converse. And conversation is actually a way of, it's a particular form of intimacy. It's an amazing thing. You can't actually drink the same beer or eat or hit the same golf ball like at the same time. You can't actually hit the same shot, but you can actually think the same thought, which is a remarkable way of being together with somebody else. And so I think Alex Hurt's question is on the right track in suggesting to us that, in being together with our friends, and particularly in talking with our friends, we do something to overcome this excessive emphasis on lines on the resume and dollars in the bank account.
Abigail, the floor is yours.
Hello. I actually have a question for Dr. Simmons, but the stories can answer too if they would like. And Dr. Simmons, I think you are the only professor here who I've not had multiple classes with, or even one. But one of the critiques that you made was about the necessity of avoiding traditionalism, which I think that Mr. Dr. Storey kind of addressed this a little bit. But Chesterton talks about tradition as the democracy of the dead, as a kind of, he says it's a trusting to a consensus of common human voices rather than some isolated or arbitrary record. So why do you think traditionalism is something that needs to be avoided, and rather than kind of consulting them in the way that the stories are here?
So I'll give one sentence reply and then let them speak. I do not actually think that they're engaging in traditionalism. I'm worried that that temptation is not shut down in their book. And so I was raising this as a concern that we've got to be careful about, and trying to help me make sense of precisely the worry that I think you're raising very well.
Well, it's interesting the way you put that right now, is writing it down. I find I really would like to talk at greater length, maybe on the treadmill next year, about all you've said, Aaron. That you worry that the traditionalist temptation is not shut down in the book. And in part, you seem to attribute to us, or maybe to people or authors in general, far more power over other people's minds than I anyway possess. And that was my fundamental kind of amusement, but also puzzlement with your remarks. I've never really found it possible to implant ideas in other people's minds, or give them a stable foundation for their lives. And so I don't know if you have, and you can tell me about it, but that's not even a plausible aim of teaching, I don't think, in my experience. So while we may not have, I don't know how you would even shut down a temptation. That doesn't almost make sense to me. But I think we are trying to, again, this book and what we're trying to do in our next book, which is thinking more about the political implications of what we've said, is primarily where we are right now on the political question, is to say we need to wake up to where we are, and we need to stop fighting the wars of religion of the 16th century. That is not what's going on. We need to stop, even although we might admire the kind of architecture of separations that Locke developed or that were developed by the American founders, they're working with different matter. They were working with different people. And we can't just like press play on the American founding again. That doesn't mean we can't learn from them. They were amazing, creative politicians, right? And we should learn from them, or we're just going to be doing something in a very amateur and inexcusable way. But we also can't repeat what they did.
I think that's in our efforts to start thinking about this, we've really realized the magnitude of the problem. That is, I'm teaching a course on the crisis of liberalism right now, and I think that crisis is very real. And the kind of thinking that would be required to properly address it strikes me as an extremely high level kind of thinking. Not just high level in the sense of conceptual sophistication, but high level in the sense of the address to practical problems. And, you know, I think of what we're doing as trying to begin to get our heads around that. But we entirely agree with Dr. Simmons on the sense that we're going to have to think this one through for ourselves. In part, the reason that we're interested in some of the books of the past is that we see people meeting the challenge of their own moments in these extraordinarily creative ways. And so they're examples in the sense that you could say that, Bach was an example for Mozart. Mozart didn't write Bach, but he looked at what Bach did. So, that's a remarkable thing to do. With that particular, setting of church music, or whatever. And that's, in this sense, I think in all of our efforts to think through the predicaments that we find ourselves in right now, which I think politically are very grave, we need to learn from the past, not to repeat it, but so as to rise to the level of these kinds of examples.
Okay, thank you very much, Abigail. That's a great question. The last question in the Q&A, which I'm sure we can all easily answer with perfect clarity and completely in 3 minutes, is from Brent Nelson, one of our colleagues who I think probably has thought about this kind of stuff from time to time. And I might just ask the question, and this could be the thing we leave everybody with. Of course, our authors are certainly invited to have the last word, but Dr. Nelson asks, is happiness the same thing as human flourishing? Can you flourish without being happy? That might be the question. So 2 minutes.
I'll repeat something I heard on a podcast yesterday. Which is somebody was talking about the Stoics and pointed out that for them, happiness is a kind of objective state. It's like you can look at a life and say, that's a flourishing life, as opposed to a feeling. And I think that's a useful thing for us to think about, that I think we put the barometer to our souls in Rousseau's formulation too often. We're taking our own temperature all the time. And this in itself is a kind of source of unhappiness. Another way another point that I think is worth stating here, particularly to an audience with a lot of students in it, is that with respect to feeling, Pascal points out to us, and I think this is in the direction of remarks that Dr. Kim was making earlier on in this, we make a huge mistake if we understand happiness to be normal. If we think most people feel great all the time, that is not, I just don't think that's the truth of human life. I think there's an awful lot of sadness and suffering in human existence. And I think we'd actually be happier for accepting that fact. That happiness is anything but a sort of a normal psychological equilibrium that most people exist in most of the time.
Okay. And so we need to have a whole follow-up to this thing where we roll it back to Olbios from Dr. Kim. I love, Ben, this idea of like constantly taking your temperature, right? Which isn't actually a sign of health. You know, like if you're doing that, something's wrong. Of course, the alternative, as Dr. Kim brought up, is to wait until you're dead and decide then if you are happy. And these are kind of two extremes, right? And I think this wonderful book can help us all navigate that, even if we navigate it by pushing back against the ideas. It's 6:30. Thank you all very much. Thank you for the gift of this book, and thank you, colleagues, for your brilliant, thoughtful comments on it. And thank you, attendees, for your attention and the thoughtful, excellent questions. I think we are good.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.